Ever wondered how history's most brilliant strategists turned their greatest threats into their most valuable assets? In the shadows of power, Niccolò Machiavelli mastered an art few ever discover: the ability to transform enemies into unwitting allies. What if I told you that the people actively working against you right now could become your greatest source of advantage? This isn't about manipulation or deception. It's about understanding the chess game of human interaction at a level most never reach. The most successful people throughout history share a common trait. They don't just overcome opposition, they convert it into momentum. While most waste energy fighting enemies head-on, the truly strategic mind finds ways to redirect that oppositional force to serve their goals. Think of it like martial arts for your career, relationships, and life ambitions. In the next few minutes, I'll reveal the exact methods Machiavelli used to realign opposing interests without others even realizing what was happening. These aren't theoretical concepts. They're practical strategies you can apply immediately in your workplace, social circles, or any challenging relationship. The person who frustrates you most today could become your greatest advocate tomorrow. Stay with me, because the fifth principle I'll share has literally transformed lives when properly applied. Get ready to see opposition not as an obstacle, but as your untapped advantage. Number 1. The mirror principle. Have you ever noticed how some people can walk into a room full of critics and leave with those same people nodding in agreement? There's a secret to this transformation that goes beyond simple persuasion. Think about the last time someone opposed your idea. What was your first reaction? Most of us immediately defend our position, creating a battle of wills where someone must lose. But what if there was a way to completely bypass this resistance? Imagine for a moment that you could take your opponent's deeply held beliefs and goals, and without changing them at all, redirect them to support your aims. This isn't wishful thinking. It's a strategic approach that the most influential leaders throughout history have used. The fascinating thing is that it doesn't require deception or manipulation, just a profound understanding of human motivation. When we encounter opposition, we typically see it as something to overcome, but Machiavelli understood something crucial. Opposition is simply energy moving in the wrong direction. The true master doesn't fight this energy, they redirect it. This approach is like finding the hidden current that carries your opponent right where you want them to go. The beauty lies in how natural it feels to them. Let me introduce you to the first of our 5 Machiavellian strategies, the mirror principle. Instead of countering opposition directly, you strategically reflect your adversary's own goals back to them through a lens that serves your interests. By presenting your desired outcome as the natural solution to their stated problem, you create a cognitive bridge they cross willingly. Consider a workplace example. Your team member opposes your project because they're concerned about resource allocation. Rather than arguing about resources, you validate their concern and point out how your project actually helps distribute resources more efficiently in areas they care about. You're not changing your project, you're reframing it to show how it naturally serves their interests. This isn't about finding compromise where you both sacrifice something. It's about restructuring the entire relationship dynamic. You're creating a situation where success for you means success for them in terms they already value. When done properly, they'll feel like they've won something important, while you've actually advanced your original goal. What makes this approach so powerful is that it bypasses rational arguments completely and taps into something much more fundamental, our need for consistency with our own stated values and goals. Your opposition often isn't really about your idea itself. It's about how your idea relates to something your opponent already values. To implement the mirror principle effectively, you need to become genuinely curious about what drives the other person. What do they need to feel successful? What pressures are they under? What vision are they trying to achieve? Once you truly understand their goals, not just their stated position, you can begin reflecting these back in ways that naturally align with your aims. Start practicing this today in small disagreements. Listen for the underlying goals behind opposition, then reframe your proposal as the natural path to those goals. With practice, you'll find that what once seemed like insurmountable opposition often transforms into enthusiastic support. And the best part? Both sides genuinely win. Number 2. Strategic vulnerability deployment. When you think of strength in negotiations or conflicts, what comes to mind? Most people picture an impenetrable fortress, showing no weakness, revealing no flaws. But what if I told you that the most powerful strategists throughout history understood that selective vulnerability could be more powerful than perfect defense? This counterintuitive approach has won wars, closed billion-dollar deals, and transformed bitter rivals into loyal supporters. Consider what happens when someone attacks you directly. Your instinct is to defend, creating a predictable back and forth that consumes energy and rarely changes minds. But there's another path, one that can completely transform the dynamics of opposition. It begins by understanding that your opponent's actions are driven by their need to feel effective, to exert influence, and to validate their own position. When we encounter resistance, we typically think in terms of weaknesses we must protect and strengths we must project. But elite strategists think differently. They see the chessboard from multiple angles and understand that sometimes the move that looks like a retreat is actually setting up a decisive victory. This isn't about being deceptive. It's about directing energy in ways that ultimately serve better outcomes for everyone involved. Our second Machiavellian strategy is what I call strategic vulnerability deployment. This involves deliberately exposing carefully selected weaknesses that encourage your opponent to invest resources in areas that ultimately strengthen your position. This counterintuitive approach creates a false summit effect where their perceived victories actually advance your deeper strategy while satisfying their need to feel effective. Here's how it works in practice. Imagine you're proposing a new initiative that faces resistance from a key stakeholder. Instead of defending every aspect of your plan, you deliberately highlight a specific limitation, perhaps a detail that isn't central to your core objective. When they attack this vulnerability, you thoughtfully acknowledge their insight and make adjustments based on their input. What happens next is fascinating. Your opponent feels validated and influential. They've won on an issue they care about. But in the process, they've unconsciously crossed an important threshold. They've begun investing in your success. They've shifted from opposing your initiative to improving it. And because they've contributed, they now have skin in the game. Their ego becomes tied to your plan's ultimate success. Meanwhile, you've protected what truly matters by directing their attention elsewhere. You've transformed their oppositional energy into constructive refinement of non-essential elements. This isn't surrendering, it's sophisticated strategy. To implement this approach effectively, you need to distinguish between your core objectives and negotiable elements. What areas can you afford to revise? Where can you invite input without compromising your essential goals? By creating space for others to exert influence, you channel their need for effectiveness in directions that ultimately serve your broader aims. I've seen this approach transform hostile business negotiations into productive partnerships. The key is authenticity. You must genuinely be open to improvement in the areas you expose. This isn't about fake concessions, but about strategically directing oppositional energy toward constructive refinement rather than outright obstruction. Start practicing this by identifying one area in your current projects where feedback, even critical feedback, might genuinely improve outcomes. Open this area to the very people who seem most resistant to your overall direction. Watch how their relationship to your broader initiative transforms when they feel their input genuinely matters. Remember, true strength isn't found in perfect invulnerability, but in knowing precisely where and how to be strategically vulnerable. By mastering this principle, you'll find that opposition often transforms into collaboration, with your opponents unwittingly becoming invested in your success. Number 3. Interest triangulation. Think about the last time you faced persistent opposition from someone. Maybe it was a colleague blocking your proposal, a family member resisting your idea, or a business partner rejecting your direction. Most people approach these situations as one-dimensional conflicts, a direct push and pull between two opposing forces. But what if there was a way to completely transform the dynamic by bringing in a third dimension? Throughout history, the most astute strategists have understood that direct confrontation often leads to entrenched positions. The harder you push, the harder your opponent pushes back. It becomes a matter of pride, with neither side willing to appear weak by giving ground. This is where conventional approaches fail. They treat opposition as a tug-of-war rather than an opportunity for strategic realignment. What if you could transform a head-on collision into a three-dimensional relationship where your opponent suddenly finds their interests naturally aligned with yours? This isn't about creating artificial alliances or temporary truces. It's about fundamentally restructuring the situation so that the path to their success naturally runs through yours. This approach doesn't just resolve the immediate conflict. It creates lasting alignment that serves everyone involved. This brings us to the third of our 5 Machiavellian strategies: interest triangulation. This involves identifying a third party whose involvement can transform your direct conflict into a three-dimensional relationship. By positioning yourself as the gateway between your opponent and this third entity's resources or approval, you create a situation where your opponent must work through you to achieve their aims, naturally aligning them with your success. Here's an example. Imagine you're trying to implement a new process at work, but you face resistance from a department head who sees your initiative as threatening their autonomy. Direct persuasion has failed. Instead of continuing this unproductive push-pull, you identify what that department head needs most, perhaps additional resources, recognition from senior leadership, or success on a key performance metric. Now you find a third party who controls access to what your opponent needs. This could be senior management, another department with complementary resources, or an external partner. You then position your initiative as the vehicle through which your opponent can gain access to these resources. Suddenly, their success depends on your success. The opposition transforms into support, not because you've convinced them of your position, but because you've restructured the relationship dynamic entirely. This approach works because it bypasses rational argumentation and taps into something more fundamental: enlightened self-interest. Your opponent doesn't need to change their mind about your idea. They simply need to see that supporting you serves their own objectives better than opposing you. The third party creates a context where cooperation becomes the most rational choice. To implement interest triangulation effectively, you need to develop a thorough understanding of your opponent's true objectives beyond their stated positions. What are they ultimately trying to achieve? What pressures are they under? What would constitute a major win for them? Similarly, you need to map out potential third parties who control access to resources, information, or recognition that your opponent values. The key is creating authentic connections rather than manipulative triangulation. All parties should genuinely benefit from the new arrangement. You're simply structuring the situation so that the path to their success runs through yours. This creates sustainable alignment rather than temporary compliance. Start practicing this by mapping the key stakeholders in your current challenging situation. For each person opposing your direction, identify what they truly need to succeed. Then look for third parties who control access to those resources or opportunities. How might you position yourself as the natural bridge connecting these parties in mutually beneficial ways? By mastering interest triangulation, you'll transform direct opposition into three-dimensional relationships where former adversaries find their interests naturally aligned with yours. This doesn't just resolve immediate conflicts, it creates enduring partnerships where everyone wins. Number 4. The invisible bridge method. Imagine trying to convince someone to cross a bridge they can't see. No matter how persuasive your words, no matter how compelling your logic, they'll hesitate at the edge. Not because they're stubborn, but because human nature resists leaps into the invisible. Yet, some of the most influential leaders throughout history have mastered the art of guiding others across unseen bridges with such subtlety that people believe they discovered the path themselves. When we face opposition, our natural instinct is to present our complete solution up front. We lay out our reasoning, our evidence, and our conclusions all at once. But this approach often triggers immediate resistance. Not necessarily because our ideas are flawed, but because people instinctively reject conclusions they didn't participate in creating. The moment someone feels an idea being imposed from outside, psychological defenses activate, and what might have been a good solution becomes a battle of wills. There's a profound psychological principle at work here. We value and defend ideas we perceive as our own far more fiercely than those presented to us fully formed. The strategic question becomes, how can you guide others to arrive at your conclusion as if it were their own discovery? This isn't about manipulation. It's about understanding human psychology and creating pathways for genuine agreement rather than compliance. Let me introduce the fourth of our 5 Machiavellian strategies, the invisible bridge method. This involves constructing a pathway between your adversary's current position and your desired outcome that feels like their own discovery. By planting conceptual seeds and allowing them to connect the dots independently, you create internal commitment to ideas they would reject if presented directly, transforming opposition into passionate advocacy. Here's how it works. Rather than presenting your complete solution, you start by establishing points of agreement, foundational principles or observations your opponent already accepts. Then you ask questions that invite them to extend their thinking in productive directions. Each question becomes a stepping stone across the invisible bridge, guiding them toward your destination without forcing the journey. For example, instead of telling a resistant colleague your conclusion about a business decision, you might say, "I've been thinking about the challenges we discussed last week. What factors do you think are most important to consider here?" Their response becomes the first step on the bridge. You follow with, "That's insightful. Given those factors, what approaches might address both the immediate concerns and the longer-term objectives?" With each question, they move further across the bridge they themselves are building. What makes this approach so powerful is that it honors the other person's agency and intelligence. You're not treating them as someone to be persuaded, but as a co-creator of the solution. When they arrive at the destination, often very near or identical to what you had in mind, they'll defend it vigorously because in their experience, they discovered it themselves. This method requires patience and genuine curiosity. You must be willing to listen closely and adapt to their contributions, rather than rigidly steering toward a predetermined script. Sometimes they'll suggest improvements to your original idea. Be open to these. The goal isn't to trick someone into accepting your exact solution, but to create a collaborative path to the best possible outcome. To practice the invisible bridge method, start by mapping out the conceptual territory between your opponent's current position and your desired outcome. What principles do you already share? What questions might naturally lead from those shared principles toward your conclusion? How can you create opportunities for them to articulate key insights themselves? This approach transforms opposition not through persuasive force, but through collaborative discovery. When someone walks across an invisible bridge of their own construction, they don't just temporarily comply with your request, they become advocates for the destination, because in their mind, they found it themselves. The next time you face resistance to an important idea, resist the urge to argue your case directly. Instead, start with questions that invite your opponent to begin building their own bridge. You'll be amazed how often they arrive precisely where you hoped they would, but with the crucial difference that now they own the journey and the destination. Number 5. Controlled opposition cultivation. Let me ask you something that might seem counterintuitive. What if the complete elimination of opposition isn't always the optimal strategy? We're conditioned to think of opposition as something to overcome, to neutralize, to defeat. But throughout history, the most sophisticated strategists have understood something that most people miss. Sometimes, carefully managed opposition can be more valuable than perfect agreement. Think about this. When everyone appears to be in complete harmony, moderate positions often face scrutiny. Without points of comparison, reasonable requests can seem extreme, and balanced approaches can appear inadequate. This reality plays out everywhere from boardrooms to international diplomacy to family dynamics. The absence of contrast often makes it harder, not easier, to achieve your actual objectives. Most people spend their energy trying to eliminate all forms of resistance. But there's a more sophisticated approach that understands opposition as a potential asset rather than merely an obstacle. This approach doesn't seek to eliminate all resistance, but instead shapes the landscape of opposition in ways that make your actual objectives appear reasonable, measured, and even necessary by comparison. This brings us to the 5th and final Machiavellian strategy, controlled opposition cultivation. Rather than eliminating all resistance, you selectively nurture specific forms of opposition that make your actual objectives appear moderate and reasonable by comparison. This creates a perceptual contrast effect where previously resistant parties become eager allies against what they now perceive as the real threat. Here's how it works in practice. Imagine you're proposing a business initiative that requires a 10% budget increase. Instead of just presenting this proposal directly, you first allow space for voices advocating for much larger increases, perhaps 30% or more. You don't personally advocate for these positions, but you ensure they're part of the conversation. When you then present your 10% proposal, decision-makers who might have originally resisted now see your approach as the reasonable middle ground. This isn't about creating artificial extremes or being manipulative. It's about ensuring that the full spectrum of possibilities is visible so that your position can be properly contextualized. Without this contrast, moderate positions often appear extreme simply because they represent change from the status quo. The key to implementing this strategy effectively is authenticity and balance. You're not creating fake opposition, but rather ensuring that naturally existing viewpoints across the spectrum are properly represented in the conversation. This approach works because it leverages a fundamental aspect of human psychology. We evaluate options relationally rather than absolutely. In organizational settings, this might mean giving voice to team members with naturally different perspectives before presenting your middle ground solution. In negotiations, it might involve acknowledging more extreme positions on both sides to highlight the reasonableness of your approach. In family decisions, it could mean ensuring all viewpoints are heard before offering your balanced compromise. What makes this approach particularly powerful is that it transforms the dynamics completely. Rather than you against the opposition, it becomes you and your former opponents united against a more extreme alternative. This creates natural alignment without requiring anyone to admit they were wrong or to abandon their core values. To practice controlled opposition cultivation, start by mapping the full spectrum of positions on your current challenge. Where does your objective fall on this spectrum? Are there naturally existing viewpoints that provide useful contrast? How can you ensure these perspectives are respectfully included in the conversation without endorsing them directly? By mastering this principle, you'll find that opposition often transforms into alliance not through direct persuasion, but through the natural human tendency to seek reasonable middle ground when presented with the full spectrum of possibilities. Your former opponents become your allies not because they've changed their minds completely, but because, in the context of the broader conversation, your position becomes the natural rallying point for reasonable people. This approach doesn't eliminate disagreement. It transforms it into a strategic asset that helps rather than hinders your objectives. And that transformation is the essence of Machiavelli's genius. As we reach the end of our journey through Machiavelli's strategic wisdom, remember that these 5 principles aren't just theoretical concepts. They're practical tools that can transform your most challenging relationships starting today. The mirror principle, strategic vulnerability deployment, interest triangulation, the invisible bridge method, and controlled opposition cultivation each offer a unique pathway to convert opposition into advantage. What unites these approaches is a fundamental shift in perspective, seeing opposition not as an obstacle to overcome, but as energy to redirect. This isn't about manipulating others, but about creating situations where mutual success becomes the natural outcome. True strategic mastery isn't found in domination, but in transformation. Begin applying these principles in small ways today. Listen more deeply to understand the goals behind opposition. Create spaces for others to contribute meaningfully. Position yourself as the bridge between people and their objectives. And remember that sometimes the path to your goals runs through territory you never expected. As Machiavelli himself might say, the greatest power lies not in defeating your enemies, but in transforming them into unwitting allies who happily advance your cause as they pursue their own.